Hello and welcome back to the Engerati studio. I'm joined now by Amy Marshall, who's a director at Engage Consulting. And Amy and I met a while back. In fact, it wasn't a while back. It seems like a while back. It was last Wednesday, where you put forward your report, which was commissioned by Smart Grid GB, about the smart grid, and it's entitled "A Great Consumer Opportunity." And I was at this meeting and I was listening to what was going on, and it struck me that while the title of the report was "A Great Consumer Opportunity," it seemed to me like it's more of a great utility opportunity that may or may not benefit the consumer, but there is more in the smart grid for the utility than there is for the consumer. Now, that's just a position. And so what was it in the report that you would draw on where you would say, well, no, here are the proof points of what it can do for consumers?
And I think maybe the subtitle that was missing was "A Great Consumer Opportunity if we all get it right." And there's quite a lot of doubt and risk around that. And I think the reason I would caveat it that way is I think clearly there's a lot for the utilities in consumer engagement around the smart grid. Clearly a lot of the business case is driven by asset investment and effective asset investments and longer life cycle on existing assets and better control and reduced field force and all of those benefits that we know about. So I think that's very fair to say. I think when we say it's a great consumer opportunity, it's firstly around how the consumer can optimally access those savings that would otherwise accrue to the utility. And we talk a little bit in the report about some of the ways that those cost savings can get smeared and get passed through to the consumer, which I think is a very important question. But also, I think more generally, given that it's I would say almost received wisdom that the smart grid is going to be a revolutionary or an evolutionary change in the way that energy is sold and bought. There is always opportunity for a consumer in those kind of large-scale changes. The mobile phone industry is a very, very well-trodden example. I think there are some parallels that can be drawn here.
Do you not think that the mobile phone industry example is, while it's relevant to a degree in terms of the types of tools you would use to communicate with the consumer, there is a fundamental difference where I can live without my mobile phone. I mean,
can you now? Really?
Some would argue maybe not, but I can't live without electricity, and that was brought home to me personally. Just 2 weeks ago, we had an emergency power outage and we didn't have power for a day. And I thought, oh, that'll be all right. But you soon realize how many things actually rely on electricity. So when you're selling a service that is that crucial, where is the benefit from a utility standpoint? I can understand the benefit of the utility investing in the smart grid because I get operational efficiencies. There are utilities in America, San Francisco, for example, where they said rolling out smart meters, the cost savings alone of not having people to walk around justified the rollout. There are examples of operational efficiencies which alone would justify the rollout. And is the issue, and it's a very UK-centric issue, because of the way our energy framework is organized, that actually the consumer needs to foot this bill, rather than a utility company saying, hey, we're going to build a smart grid?
Well, there are a couple of things there. So I think you're absolutely right to say that the way consumers benefit from things which are an essential rather than a nice to have, depending on where you draw the line about what's essential, is quite different. But that's not just because something is a commodity, isn't to say you can't do innovative things around how you engage with the consumer and how they benefit from it. So I agree with the analogy, but I think it's not quite that simple. And in terms of the real beneficiary, the examples that you call out around things like smart meter rollouts being justified only on the basis of the operational benefits are valid, but I've actually forgotten the question. I forgot the second part of the question.
I mean, I think the point I was trying to make was in when you look at the construct of the UK energy section, and you've got and we should divorce smart meters from the smart grid. You know, you can have smart meters without having a smart grid. I would argue that if you're building a smart meter, you'd be daft not to have a smart grid. You'd be daft not to have the smart meter. And I just wonder whether in the UK, because of this sort of competitive energy environment, where actually the utility company is being asked to foot the infrastructure bill, that actually creates a unnecessary pressure, rather than, let's say, if you were running this business and you owned it soup to nuts, you would probably look at it and go, you know what, the smart grid investment makes sense because I can put more renewables on stream. I can get operational efficiencies around predicting outages before they happen. I can see clusters of components that are about to go belly up, so that I don't just switch one meter, I switch 8 of them because I know they're all faulty. So I'm just wondering whether you know that construct where the consumer is footing the bill, or the perception that the consumer is footing the bill, is kind of wrong.
Yes, I'd agree. And I think, so you're right, the UK structure has got particular nuances to it, and I think one of the things we call for in the report is around ensuring that because of our constructs we have some clearer data points around where investment needs to be made in the smart grid, if you extend that all the way out to the meter and all the way kind of back to transmission, versus where the benefits arise. So I think there are certainly some cases where there could be cost incurred at some point in the value chain and the benefit actually arises elsewhere, and that might include a network investment for which the benefit accrues to the consumer, or actually the other way and go further upstream. So I think there are some complexities and there's certainly some research to do there. I think it's always difficult to prove a negative, and I think one of the big challenges around smart metering business cases and smart grid business cases, particularly when we look at how the consumer benefits financially from them, although there are broader consumer benefits, I believe, the ability for that network investments to reduce or even just to curtail the rises in energy costs that would have been seen otherwise is a really important part of the case, but it's quite difficult to communicate, which is one of the reasons that we think consumer engagement and thinking about it early for the smart grid is quite important. Those messages are complex.
And do you think that the energy industry, I'll give the utilities a break now for a second, but the energy industry, the government as well, because one of the other things in your report was, hang on, we may need a bigger campaign here, a bit like the digital switchover campaign, which was a centrally funded campaign. You know, this is what's going to happen. Needs to treat the consumers a bit less, or credit them with a bit more intelligence, and look at some of the things around saying, look, this is why we need to do this. Make the case for more renewables within our energy supply. Make the case that makes us less reliant on wholesale gas tariffs, for example, which no one has control over. And try and move the conversation away a little bit, and this is the point I'm trying to make, just wholly about tariffs. And what does the consumer pay? I know it's a bit of political football at the moment, and especially with the recent announcement of a price hike. But do you think that's the sort of campaign we need?
I think, so we do call in the report largely because I think there is value in consistency in messaging, given that energy policy and the energy landscape is complex and changing. I think there is certainly merit in looking at consistency messaging, which may be driven through a central body. Not completely wedded to it, but I think it's worth considering. I think I would agree that the focus on tariffs is probably valid. Most of the research that we saw did support the fact that consumers are not always primarily, and not always as the first case, but certainly financials and costs will be a significant consideration, regardless of the category of consumer. So I think the reason that cost is always the thing that is a political football is one of the reasons that you see a lot of focus on tariffing. I think some of the more complex smart grid interventions, things like DSR, things that talk about control, things that give people access to richer data, are other benefits and other areas that perhaps haven't quite been as visible to the consumer yet, and I think they warrant some attention as well.
Is that because they're actually incredibly complex, which is a fact, and the energy industry hasn't quite got their head around how to convey a complex problem in a simple way? Not simple as in people don't get it, but
what does it mean for me? What do I have to do? What action do I have to take?
And look at people's attention span. You know, it's not getting any longer.
Yes,
you know, so you need to hit people right between the eyes.
Completely agree. And I think there's a twofold thing here. There's the kind of general consistency of messaging, which is about broader context around energy, around the energy environment, as I say, which is useful. But I think in terms of when we want consumers to do something, absolutely. Why, and whether we call it demand side management or demand side response, I don't think should be the primary concern. I think it should be a simple matter of what do I get, whether it's cost saving or something else. What do I have to do? How do I change my behaviour? And how do you make it really simple for me? And I think that kind of thinking is something that needs to mature.
And it's one of those lessons where those pieces of jargon and three-letter acronyms perhaps ought to be dropped out of all this messaging, because demand side response means a lot to people gathered here, but not a lot to my mum or anybody else. So I'd agree with that. Going back to your report, because clearly you put a lot of work into that report, and just give us a bit of context about how was the report shaped? Was there sort of original consumer research that went into it? What's the construct of the report?
Okay, so Engaged Consulting produced the report on behalf of Smart Grid GB. Smart Grid GB are an association who has a membership made up of utility companies and also participants from throughout the supply chain. A lot of technology companies, service providers, consultants are in there. So it's a very broad-based membership, which I think is quite unusual. When Smart Grid GB were going through their annual planning cycle, they were asking members what they thought was important in order to stimulate and accelerate the development of smart grid, particularly in Great Britain. And consumer engagement was one of the areas that they felt there was more focus on metering, less focus on the more generic problem. The report itself does a couple of things. It tries to firstly get the debate about smart grid rather than metering consumer engagement into people's minds early, given that we're in relatively early stages of development of smart grid projects at scale in Great Britain. It looks at best practice worldwide in the utility sector, so we draw on a number of case studies from the US, from Australia, from Europe, both commercial and government funded, to see what consistency there was across those different types of projects.
So I was just going, because we're kind of coming to the end of our time here, I was just wanted you to perhaps pull out an example, and I'll give you an opportunity to do both sides of the coin.
Okay.
An example of how not to do a smart grid rollout, and the best case study, the one when you were looking through it and you go, wow, that's good.
Yeah.
You know.
So, and that's a bit tricky actually, because there was no silver bullets. So there are lots of really good examples and there are a couple of really poor examples. So I think the themes rather than the instances are probably relevant. So the things that came through really strongly in terms of best practice were, sounds very simple actually, tell people what's going to happen before it happens, tell them consistently, make messages available through multiple channels, whether it's media, whether it's print media, whether it's online, whether it's through their bill, whether it's something through the letterbox, be consistent across those methods, make it really clear what's going to change, make it very clear what the benefits are, and make sure that all of that collateral is aesthetically pleasing and clean and clear. And then, and I think it sounds very simple, but there were a number of examples of people not getting those basics right, and those where they did were far more strongly able to justify or to meet their original business case and their original timescales.
and nothing wrong with simple. You know, I think occasionally everybody needs to be reminded that there's some basics that need to be done and done well in order to build something a bit more complex on it. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us in the studio and answering those questions. And also, your report is available on your website, Engage Consulting.
EngageConsulting.co.uk.
And the Smart Grid GB website. And Engerati is going to take it as well. So it's available on 3 websites. And Google does a pretty good job of helping you find it as well. So if in doubt, go there. Thank you once again, and thank you for watching. This has been another interview from European Utility Week, and we've got many more interviews lined up, but also all the presentations from the conference will be available online on Engerati, and we look forward to seeing you in person at the event or online again. Thank you again for watching.